Vivia Twilight is a character from the game Master Detective Archives Raincode. He's most prominent in Chapter 4 of the game. He's a major character, and of the various detectives that assist the protagonist Yuma during the story, he's arguably the most significant. He probably goes through greater change and experiences more development than the others. Vivia is one of my personal favorite characters from the game, which does tie into Chapter 4 being one of my favorite chapters of the game, although Chapter 5 is pretty close to it. The entirety of Chapter 4 completely ruined me, and I am still upset about it. Anyway, let's get right into it and take a closer look at Vivia Twilight. First up, obviously, is the character's name. I've had trouble with analyzing the names of characters from Raincode in the past, but Vivia's is actually pretty simple, so needless to say, I'm pretty thankful for that. Vivia itself is a name, although not a very common one. When I first saw it, I thought it was pretty similar to the more well-known name Vivian. Both names have roots in the Latin words vivere and vivis, which I probably said incorrectly, and I apologize, which mean to live and alive, respectively. This ties Vivia as a character to the concept of life. The word twilight has a few different definitions. First, it can refer to the light that is seen in the sky when the sun is below the horizon. It can also refer to the time of day in which this light appears between daylight and darkness. And as a note, twilight happens at both morning and night. Unlike the concepts of dawn and dusk, twilight is not time-specific. It happens both before sunrise and after sunset. The third definition for twilight refers to a period or state of obscurity, ambiguity, or gradual decline. As mentioned before, Vivia's first name centers around life, which is a concept that is central to his character as a whole. He generally doesn't seem interested in life. He's often saying he wants to die someday, which aren't exactly the words of someone who values their life. Equally important to his character, though, is the opposite of life: death. With Twilight being a sort of midpoint since it happens between day and night, Vivia's entire name references how he's sort of between alive and dead. He's definitely alive, there's nothing you can really say against that, but he's also able to turn himself into a ghost and interact with the world of the dead. He exists in both the world of the living and the world of the dead, like he's in a twilight between the two. I think Vivia's name is pretty cool, and I'm very glad it's easy to analyze for a change. I don't really have anything else to say on the topic of his name, so let's move on. Vivia is a pretty interesting looking guy. He's one of the tallest characters in the game, and if I remember correctly, then only Dominic Fulltank is taller than him, and on the rare occasion that he's actually standing, he's usually kind of hunched over. The irises of Vivia's eyes look like plus signs, which indicate a sort of addition or a positive value. The designs in the eyes of the other characters I've looked at so far are kind of easy to figure out, but Vivia's are a bit trickier for me. If I'm being honest, I can really only make guesses and assumptions about what the plus signs mean, and there's no explanation that I'm, fully confident in. My best assumption is that the plus signs mean he's kind of dead in addition to being alive. Speaking of Vivia's eyes, he also wears purple eyeliner, and on the right side of his face, that eyeliner is styled to look like a drop. Since it's right under his eye, it can be interpreted as looking like a teardrop. Now, this might be a bit of a stretch, and I could be reaching here, but hear me out. Purple as a color can symbolize spirituality, which makes perfect sense here because Vivia can turn himself into a spirit. If you see the design of the eyeliner as a teardrop, and people often cry when they're sad or upset, then this small detail could be taken to represent the pain and suffering that Vivia has endured because of his forte. It hasn't exactly been easy for him to hear the voices of the dead his entire life. Instead of an actual shirt, Vivia wears black bandages wrapped around his body. This seems like an odd choice, especially for someone as unmotivated as him, because you'd think it would be easier to just put on an actual shirt than wrap these bandages every morning. But who am I to judge? Maybe he just likes the way it looks. The bandages also kind of resemble the way Egyptian mummies were wrapped, which further adds to the idea that Vivia is somewhere between alive and dead. On the right side of his jacket, Vivia wears a badge from the WDO, which signifies his position as a detective. Though, as we'll discuss later, this isn't a position he's very confident in, at least not at first. In terms of personality, Vivia can often come across as unmotivated and lazy. He frequently complains about having to do just about anything, including walking and eating. Even in his ghost form, he doesn't want to move around very much. This attitude of his doesn't just border on unhealthy because it sailed right over that line a long time ago. Vivia's poor mental state comes in part, if not entirely, from his forte. He's always been able to see and hear the dead, which is understandably quite exhausting. It's akin to someone who experiences hallucinations, except what Vivia experiences is completely real. Despite his unmotivated attitude, though, Vivia is quite observant. Part of this is because of his forte. Being able to turn into a ghost means that he can observe and watch other people without being noticed. He's still observant even without his forte though, since he pieces together most, if not all, of the mystery in Chapter 4 without using the ability. One of Vivia's favorite hobbies, and actually it might just be his favorite hobby, is reading. He often reads books that bring up questions about morality and human nature, and he finds these stories very interesting even though most other people around him don't. He doesn't claim to have a genre preference, but he enjoys stories with no logical explanation, such as ones with paranormal elements. This ties into his belief that not all mysteries should be solved, which is a core part of his character. Another easily noticed trait of Vivia's is his habit of lying in odd or cramped places, such as the fireplace in the submarine or underneath the piano at the hotel. He does this because these places remind him of good memories, or at least ones he perceives as being good. He tells Yuma that when he was younger, his parents would lock him in the storage room as discipline. Yuma points out that this sounds pretty traumatic, which is a very reasonable reaction to have, but Vivia doesn't agree. He grew up with a lot of brothers, so he enjoyed his parents' attention no matter what form it came in. This is only mentioned once, and Vivia never talks about his past again, but just this one detail alone makes it pretty likely that his parents were abusive and neglectful. Despite this, he views the memories of his childhood as good. He later says childhood memories may not all be beautiful, but they are nonetheless innocent, which could be an explanation for why he still perceives these memories as good. Vivia's insistence on viewing these memories as good could tie into his avoidance of the truth. Admitting that the way his parents treated him was wrong and hurtful wouldn't be an easy thing to do. It would damage or shatter the positive memories that he believes he has. So it's not unthinkable that someone who avoids harsh truths would instead choose to believe that the memories of their abuse are a good thing. As he mentions multiple times, Vivia doesn't enjoy fights or arguments, and he avoids conflict whenever possible, presumably because it's just too much trouble. He avoids certain topics by speaking in sort of vague and metaphorical ways to just talk around the issue rather than actually talking about it. It's unclear whether this habit is intentional or not, since he just starts talking vaguely when Yuma asks him about it. And the last important aspect of Vivia's personality that I want to mention is his desire for peace and quiet. It seems like his biggest goal is to find this, probably to get away from the sights and sounds of the dead that he's constantly experiencing. Yako and the Nocturnal Detective Agency are so important to him because he found peace and quiet with them. And so, because he found what he was searching for so long, he's terrified of any threat to it. For the most part, Vivia is kind of absent from the first half of the story. He doesn't play any important roles in the first few chapters. During group discussions, he doesn't even speak much, and sometimes he's just out of frame and can't be seen at all. In Chapter 1, he introduces the game's side quests by asking Yuma to find a book for him, but that's about it. Chapters 2 and 3 contain hints that Vivia knows about, or is at least aware of Shinigami's presence and the Book of Death. At the end of Chapter 2, he calls Yuma a death detective and says that Death has taken a liking to him. In Chapter 3, Shinigami starts to seem kind of unnerved by Vivia, but she doesn't explain why. There's even a point where he seems to be watching her as she moves. And of course, the end of Chapter 3 has a massive moment of foreshadowing when Vivia is alone and he emerges from the fireplace with a box cutter. At least I think it's a box cutter. I'm pretty sure that's what it is. He knows Yuma used the Book of Death, which he believes is dangerous enough to destroy Kanai Ward or even the world itself. This is when it's made abundantly clear that he knows what Yuma has been up to, and he doesn't like it. And then we get to Chapter 4, where Vivia plays his biggest role yet, and his forte, spectral projection, is finally revealed. When the group is trapped in the lab, he believes they should surrender to the Peacekeepers because it would give Yako a chance of surviving. He also refuses to investigate the murder of Dr. Weska at first. Vivia is so strongly against investigating the doctor's murder that he even threatens Yuma's life over it. Since he takes such a drastic measure, it's easy to conclude that by this point, he already knows, or at least strongly suspects, that Yako is the culprit. And since he knows that Yuma has been using the Book of Death, he also knows that if he solves the case, Yako is certain to die. Thus, he wants to stop Yuma from investigating by any means necessary. Of all the detectives that join Yuma in investigating the various cases, Vivia is easily the most involved in the mystery labyrinth. He starts out wanting to remain completely uninvolved, but as the mystery unravels, he even turns against Yuma and acts as an enemy. Vivia's opposition begins when he points out that none of the questions answered up until that point directly addressed the identity of the culprit. He accuses Yuma of subconsciously turning away from the truth despite Yuma's claims to the contrary. By turning against Yuma, Vivia forces him to think about the mystery and truly face the truth of the case. Though he definitely started out trying to stop Yuma from solving the mystery, I think he was also testing him to see if he would be able to handle the truth when it was revealed. Vivia strongly suspected that Yako was the culprit from the very beginning, but he tried to ignore that for the sake of the peace and quiet that he found with him and the agency. The fact he was willing to go so far as to threaten to kill Yuma over this proves how important Yako was to him. By the end of the chapter, though, he's chosen to face the truth and lends a hand to Yuma to help him seal the deal on the case. He's determined to see what lies beyond the truth he was trying so hard to avoid. When the mystery labyrinth doesn't fall apart immediately, and there are still some questions to be answered, Vivia is determined to stick by Yuma until the very end. He's genuinely enraged by the reveal that Yomi instigated Yako to kill Dr. Weska, even saying that he's never been that angry before in his life. It's a very stark change from how indifferent he seemed for most of the game. Back at the agency, Vivia shows Yuma a letter that Yako received about his wife's death. It was this letter that Yomi used to push Yako to kill Dr. Weska. The letter arrived shortly after Vivia was dispatched to Kanai Ward, and although he knew Yako was planning something, he tried to just turn away and ignore it. Vivia wants to believe that Yako was uncertain about the plan the entire time, even if he acknowledges this could just be another comforting lie that he's telling himself. Then we get to chapter 5, and Vivia's not there because, whoops, nobody is. Well, a few people are, but they're not relevant here. Vivia's final appearance is in the epilogue. He tried to hide in his suitcase in the hopes that somebody would carry him out, which is very on brand for a guy who doesn't want to walk anywhere. But of course, it doesn't work. After the detectives have a final chat with Kurumi, Vivia departs, and he doesn't even bring his suitcase. Vivia's DLC episode shows him looking into the case of a building where multiple people have taken their lives. It introduces us to Ryo, a woman who is later revealed to be the ghost of the first person to take their own life at the building. She chose to linger in the world of the living in hopes of stopping anyone who was planning to make the same mistake she did. I don't feel the need to cover the entire story of the DLC because the most important thing it does is show the bond between Vivia and Yako. Brief flashbacks show us that Yako was constantly worried about Vivia, like when he checked in to make sure he had eaten something. Vivia claims to Ryo that there's no one who would miss him if he died. However, this idea is challenged when he sees Yako searching for him. Yako seems panicked and worried as he's looking for Vivia, and Ryo says that this means he must care about him. She urges Vivia to turn away because he has someone he can return to. The DLC ends with Vivia wondering if he can find what he's looking for with Yako in the agency. This episode really emphasizes Yako's importance to Vivia, and it adds a lot more context and meaning behind Vivia's actions in Chapter 4. It further explains why he's so desperate to avoid the truth behind Dr. Weska's death. This one is my personal favorite of the DLC episodes. It had me in tears the first time that I played it, and it even almost made me cry again when I went back to take notes on it for this video. I love how it displays the bond between Vivia and Yako, and it just makes Chapter 4 even more heartbreaking. Vivia's forte is spectral projection, which is the ability to move around in a ghost form, ignoring the laws of physics. In this form, he's completely invisible and can pass through solid objects. There are limitations, though. The ghost form cannot possess people, it cannot interact with objects, and it cannot be seen or heard at all. The forte is rooted in Vivia's ties to the spiritual realm where ghosts reside. He says he's been able to see and hear otherworldly things since he was young, and he gained his forte through honing that natural ability. Because of his forte, Vivia was always aware of Shinigami's presence, but he normally couldn't see her as anything more than a haze following Yuma. When using spectral projection, though, he could see her clearly. This connection to the spiritual world even unnerves Shinigami multiple times, and she can tell there's something odd about Vivia. Vivia's connection to the spiritual world also allows him to maintain his memories during and after the mystery labyrinth. He's the only detective to remember everything, and this is kind of necessary for his development. His change and the impact of Chapter 4 just wouldn't hit nearly as hard if he didn't remember anything. Vivia has no control over seeing and hearing the dead, and this has greatly influenced him. In his DLC episode, he says that everything the dead tell him is true, so he grew tired of the truth, which contributed to his avoidance of it. Also in his DLC DLC, he describes himself to Ryo as someone with one foot on the other side. He says he's a ghost, but also that his body still lingers in this world. This specific wording here makes it seem like he either died or came very close to it in the past, and thus his forte could be rooted in that. Death as a concept is so crucial to Vivia's character that it's even baked into his birthday, April 4th, or the 4th day of the 4th month. In Japanese culture, there are some superstitions around the number 4 because one pronunciation for it, shi, is identical to the word for death. Vivia is implied to perhaps be beyond the limits of normal human mortality. A discussion he has with Yuma in his gumshoe gab implies outright immortality, but this is never confirmed because he doesn't give a solid explanation either way. He just tells Yuma that he's free to think whatever he wants. Vivia's forte is the only one we never get a clear explanation for. Halara and Desuhiko both explain the origins of their fortes, and although Fubuki doesn't, it's easy enough to assume where her forte comes from. But Vivia doesn't fully explain the roots of his forte. When it's first revealed, it's not even him that explains it. Halara does it for him because he just talks around it. Since we know he does this when he doesn't want to talk about something, we can assume that his forte is something he doesn't really want to discuss. Because of his ties to the spiritual realm, Vivia doesn't see a clear border between life and death. He's alive, but constantly seeing and hearing the dead. He's always existed in both worlds, and neither one is any more or less real to him. Despite his general lack of motivation to live, Vivia won't let anyone else kill him, and he says as much in his DLC episode. He tells Ryo that he'll die when he's ready, but he won't let someone else take him away. It's a kind of I die on my terms attitude, and I can really respect that. Vivia's forte is pretty cool, and I do think it serves its purpose within the investigation for Chapter 4. It's a good solution to getting around the Peacekeepers. My only complaint is that they make kind of a big deal of saying, oh, you don't have to follow the laws of physics, and then they don't let you phase through every wall you come across. So that was kinda disappointing. The biggest aspect of Vivia's character and development is the truth. He believes not all mysteries need to be solved, and not all truths need to be exposed. He would sooner believe a comforting lie over a harsh truth. In his gumshoe gab, Vivia tells Yuma the story of a rookie detective who is looking into the death of a woman at her daughter's request. The detective discovers that the daughter's actions resulted in her mother's death, even if completely unintentionally. He doesn't tell Yuma how the story ends, and he instead wants him to think about what the detective should do. Would it be worth it for the detective to expose that truth? It's left uncertain if this was a story he read or something that he himself experienced. In Chapter 4, although he suspects from the very beginning that Yako is the culprit, he tries to ignore it for the sake of his peace and quiet. He even threatens Yuma's life over it. He has no pride as a detective, and he basically says he'd never wanted to be one. He pursues mysteries for reasons other than wanting the truth. In his DLC, he's not interested in the truth behind the suicides at the buildings. Instead, he takes an interest in Ryo, the ghost woman. Vivia starts to come around to accepting the truth when Yako's spirit tells him and Yuma to stop fighting. Yako's voice urges them to find and confront the truth, even if it hurts. Before confronting the truth, though, Vivia wants to find out what might lie beyond it. Although he's hurt and saddened by Yako's plot and death, he still wants to hold on to the peace that he found with him. He doesn't believe anything that happened negates how important Yako was to him. In the end, he's able to face the truth, and he finally calls himself a detective. In conclusion, Vivia Twilight is a very important character, and I love him very much. This ended up being way longer than I expected it to, but I guess I just have a lot to say about this guy. Vivia's presence in Chapter 4 is incredible, and he's the only detective to actively oppose Yuma during the investigation in Mystery Labyrinth. Both characters influence each other. Yuma's insistence helps Vivia confront and accept the truth, and Vivia's opposition kind of helps prepare Yuma for the later massive reveals about Kanai Ward and himself. His DLC was incredible, and it still makes me emotional. The build-up to the reveal that he knew about Shinigami was pretty cool too, with the small hints in Chapters 2 and 3. Basically, to sum it all up, I love Vivia, and I think he's pretty great. Easily one of my favorite characters. If you enjoyed this video, I would appreciate it if you could leave a like and subscribe if you want to see more, because I'm not out of Raincode characters to analyze just yet. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.